Emissary. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be continuing our JavaScript mini-series here. And today I would like to talk about something that is somewhat confusing, but also I think is very important to know. And that is the basic JavaScript types, the primitive types in JavaScript. And all that means is that JavaScript is giving you a bunch of values to work with. And the values are represented by these different types. So they can either be Boolean, number, string, null, or undefined. We also have these two other ones over here, which are big int and symbol. I don't want to go too into those yet, just because you might not be using them too much in your code. I certainly haven't used them very rarely, just because of how specific the use case for them is. But for now, I just want to cover the most basic ones that you guys will see every day in your code. So let's start with Boolean. So I'm just going to use console.log here, which is the JavaScript way of saying print this on the page or print this to the output. And our output here, as you see, we're using VS Code as the editor. And I've downloaded an extension called JavaScript REPL. And it's a very useful extension. It helps you visualize the values that you're going to see. So if we say 5 here, it tells us that this will be 5, right? And obviously this is super easy, but once you have a lot of code and you have multiple variables adding together, multiplying together, taken away from an array and doing all this other stuff, you want to know exactly what it's showing you so that you don't have to go in and debug it yourself. You can just tell what it's doing here. So we're using console log to show what these types are going to be doing for us. So let's start with Boolean. So a Boolean is either true or false, and it's the most basic type in JavaScript. It is just one bit of data, and that one bit is a switch in your computer, which is either turned on or turned off. And so it can be either true or false. And we use the keywords true and false to denote these two options for Boolean. And Boolean it's useful when you start doing conditionals, when you want to check if something is equal to something, if something matches something, if it's less than, greater than, if it contains something. So there's a lot of checks that you can do. So when you want to do a conditional and run a piece of code based on a certain condition, you'll want to be using Booleans for that. And you'll also want to be using comparators and comparisons to check if whatever your condition matches. And we'll go through that in another video in the series. But for now, just know that you can have true or false as the options for a Boolean. And if you can see here, they print out true and false, and they are the keywords, the same thing as the keywords here. Now, don't get this confused with the string true or the string false. Now, you can see if I save those, it gives us, you see these little quotes here? These denote that the thing we're looking at is actually a string, meaning a word. So JavaScript does not see this as a keyword, but it sees it as a basic word or a string of characters. So if I take off these quotes, and by the way, guys, JavaScript, double quotes, single quotes, they're the same thing, unless they're nested. So if they're not nested, they act the same way. They both denote that this thing is a string. So here now this true and this true over here are two different things. As you can see, our console here is printing out that this thing is the keyword true, which is the Boolean, and this one is the string true, which is just the word true. So don't get confused there. So next we have numbers, and numbers contain, they're numbers, right? So you can have 0, that's a number. As you can see here, it gives you the number sign to tell you that it's a number. Oh, I forgot to show you guys using this REPL, if you do true, it gives us this Boolean here, this big B, and that just tells us that it's a Boolean. So we're going back to numbers. We can do like 7, for example. And as you can see on the right there, that this is a number. Now we can also do floats, which are decimal values. And as you can see, they're still numbers. They haven't changed form. They're still a number, but they're a more detailed version of a number because they have the decimal values. So just know that you can add, subtract, multiply, and do anything you want to floats as if they were numbers. So you can add a number and a float, and that'll work perfectly fine because they're both in the type number. They are subtypes of number, but they're both numbers. So an integer and a float are both numbers, but they are each their own subtype, being integer and float. So that's numbers. You can have any number you want, 1,000, 10,000, and you can do stuff with numbers like adding them together, anything you would do in your basic math. You can have power of 2, and it squares the number, and that was just telling us there what the value was. So that's numbers. Strings, as you've already seen, can be used to denote a word. So this is the word John. It's not a keyword in JavaScript, but it is the word John that JavaScript will treat as a basic word in English, in our case. And you can use other languages as well. So JavaScript here is seeing this as the word John made up of a bunch of characters. And strings are used mainly for identification purposes. You want to save, for example, you have a website and you want to save the user's name, the user's email. So you would save all of that in strings because you want to identify what characters make up this person's name, email, description, biography, whatever your website shows. If you are on a blog post, all of that is in strings because the website has already saved everything that it wants to show you in a string format, and then when you go to that page, it just gives you the entire string, and then you get to see it as a bunch of characters. So that's what strings are for. They're for saving words. And here, lastly, we're going to go to these two guys here, which are the more confusing types in JavaScript, and that is null and undefined. And you spell them both with the lowercase. So this is null, and as you can see over here, it's giving us like this crossed out value, this slash here, and that's just to say that this is an empty value. It's a nothing value. Okay, so this null does not contain a number, a string. It doesn't contain anything, but it is weirdly its own type. It has to be set up as its own type here, that this is a null but not anything else, and at the same time it contains no value. So that's null. You'll use null when you set up an empty variable and then you want to access it later on, and then you want to check if it's null. Other than that, null not widely used, but a lot of times when you return, let's say from an API, and something doesn't exist, it might give you null, so that you would have to do a check on the null to see if it's there. If it's not there, then you can, this is a value, you can do what you want. But a lot of the times when you are reading data from a database or from an API, you will see that a lot of things come back as null, and you'll want to check for that. Now, in the same kind of breath here, we're going to also look at undefined. And as you can see here, it's spelled the same way, undefined, except lowercase. And undefined is just JavaScript's way of saying, I don't know what this is. It's something that has not been defined yet. It's like a variable that hasn't been set in the code yet. So if you can see here, it's giving us this little question mark as the symbol. And that's just the way they've visualized that we don't know what this is yet. And this will happen when we create a complex type, which in JavaScript is an object. So we're going to say const record equals this, right? And for our purpose, we're going to leave this record empty. We could fill it up with these other types, with these other native types here. But instead, for now, we're just going to leave it empty. And we're just going to say console.log record dot name. And as you can see here, it gives us undefined because we have not told this record what the name key should be pointing to. So in our record object, so in JavaScript these are called objects. You denote them with the curly braces. In our record object, we do not have a key name, and therefore JavaScript says, well, this is undefined. You can define it if you want, but for now it remains undefined on this variable. Now if we go ahead and define it as, we give it a name John. Now this is a record of this object with a name pointing to the string John. So now record.name points to the string John, and it's not undefined anymore because we have a value to it. It's a real value. But if we remove this, it goes right back to being undefined. So those guys are the basic JavaScript types, the primitive types, and I hope you kind of got not a detailed view of what each of them does, because we haven't covered that yet, but I did want to throw them all out there just so that you can see the world of values that you're working with, the kind of the big picture, the universe of values that you can use, and maybe a little taste of how each of them look, how each of them are used. And obviously we will go into more depth as we go into math and numbers. We will go into the number types more. As we go into conditionals, we'll be using Boolean a lot, and null and undefined we will go into as we look into objects and arrays. So thank you guys for watching. Watch out for the next couple videos, which we will get into all this stuff, and I hope you learned something. See you guys on the next one.